Hey guys, how's it going? It's Ben here on the 100-Day Video Challenge. A few days ago, I did the video on the Eurotech International plant, the one that had basically all the posted signs for a toxic area because of the beryllium presence. And I had to admit, I'm ashamed and disappointed in myself because I felt like I was kind of flip about it, kind of naive. I want to go into these videos more informed. I don't want to do the research after the fact and then feel guilty about something I didn't say or how I said it. I want to say the right thing the first time and then not regret anything, you know what I'm saying? Because as soon as I got home and was able to do some research on beryllium and beryllium disease and realized how upsetting it really is, how it can really affect the human body, and kill people. Obviously. I got really just emotional because, here I'm just kind of looking at this building and, I don't know the history behind it. And doing more research, I found out that was the old Brush-Wellman plant. In the 40s through the 60s, they made beryllium pebbles for nuclear reactors in the Cold War. And obviously beryllium disease, its particulates get into the lungs and scar the lungs. It's a cancer-causing agent, obviously. And there's really nothing anybody can do about it. It's one of the most damaging elements there is. And that's why they're protecting the facility so well, because of beryllium particulates present in the building material, in the stones, in the walls. It's all there. So if you go there and disturb it, you could stir it up. You're not getting the dust like if they were manufacturing it, right there. Obviously it's been closed for quite a while, but you're getting exposure to it possibly still being present. And I came across an article called "The Story from Lucky, Ohio, Battling Beryllium Disease," and I'm going to share that with you now. Meet Marilyn Miller, no longer with us. She died on April 13th, 1998, after a debilitating 30-year battle with beryllium disease. She lived to be 68 and spent the last few years of her life restricted to an oxygen tank, a signature downfall of this horrid disease. Mrs. Miller contracted beryllium disease at a local Brush-Wellman plant in the 50s, located in Lucky, Ohio. The same plant we visited merely days ago. This is from the article in the Toledo Blade. The plant at that time was producing tons of beryllium metal for nuclear bombs for the Cold War. She worked there for only 4 years, all as a secretary. Articles, which include interviews shortly before Marilyn's passing, state she was only 19 at the beginning of her employment and was not informed of the risks that could incur from her job, even though she never directly handled any of the alloy, dust, or other harmful chemicals. Sadly, after her death, this is not the only time the family will deal with the disease. Marilyn's youngest son, Dave, has it too. He began working at the Brush-Wellman plant in Elmore, Ohio, due to the pay offered, despite his mother's pleas against it. Beryllium disease has no cure, so first, to watch the woman they all love and admire deteriorate before their eyes, it's a hard realization that her own son will too encounter his problem in time. The issue is, Brush-Wellman is too concerned about money that they refuse to stop producing these harmful toxic substances. Nationwide, hundreds have suffered like Marilyn. Locally, more than 50 people either have the disease or have already died from it. The irony is that beryllium, through its use in nuclear weapons, was supposed to help protect families like the Millers. Yet it did not do much better through the negligence the company has in helping protect the employees of this large business. Below I have included excerpts from columns that run Marilyn's story. I encourage you to read and marvel at the woman's courage, strength, and tenacity to live the last years of her life, though crippled with the disease, happily and loved by her family. She is a petite woman with a pointed nose, short hair, and gold-rimmed glasses. She is wearing jeans, a pullover shirt, and her oxygen hose, a tiny tube that slips around her ears and into her nose. She sits at the kitchen table and says she wants to tell her story. She wants people to know how she got this disease and what it has done to her. Her husband, Jack, a 72-year-old who still gets up at 5 a.m. to milk the cows, sits across from her and says she looks good today. I can tell if she's having a good day or if the bed is made. If the bed is made, he says. If I have to make the bed, I know she's having a bad day. The last few days, I've been pretty good, she says, smiling. Bed's made, he says. She laughs, then tells a story about a doctor who thought green beans played a role in how she felt. Either I should eat them or I shouldn't. I can't remember, she says, waving it off with a hand. She laughs, and she jokes. It's hard to believe she's really that sick. Marilyn grew up not far from here, on a farm in Wayne, Ohio. She worked as hard as the men, pitching hay, hauling manure, shucking corn. She grew so strong that when she was a freshman at Montgomery Local High School, she could throw the shot put farther than the boys. And she was a pretty girl, a cheerleader with thick hair, penetrating eyes, and a mischievous smile. She met Jack when she was 18, and her then boyfriend asked Jack to pitch for his baseball team. He did, stealing Marilyn away in the process. They were married the next year in 1949 in a small ceremony in Jerry City, Ohio. 6 months later, she took a job at a factory in nearby Lucky. It was a beryllium plant owned by the U.S. government but operated by the Cleveland firm Brush Beryllium, predecessor to Brush Wellman. The factory had a critical role at a critical time. The Cold War was in full swing, and beryllium was needed for America's nuclear weapons. Marilyn didn't give it much thought. She was just 19, and to her, this was just a job, her first real job. She earned about $50 a week working as a secretary, typing, filing, answering phones. Never, she says, did she think she was in any danger. She says no one told her beryllium dust could harm her, that workers in other plants had died, or that her plant was exceeding safety limits. If I had known that, I wouldn't have worked here, she said. Still, she was only near the big dust-generating machines once a day to collect slips of paper with numbers on them. She can't remember what the numbers stood for, but she had to carefully log them into a book, sometimes rubbing her tired eyes when she was through. One year, her face broke out in a rash so severe that her eyes swelled up and she could barely see. Again, she had no idea that it was a sign that she might be susceptible to a fatal disease. 4 years later, in 1953, she was laid off and never went back. With 2 children to raise, she had other things to do. In 1965, when Marilyn was 35, she noticed she kept running out of breath. People could go out square dancing and dance up a storm, and I couldn't finish one set, she recalls. She thought she was just getting old, but when the problem worsened, she went to see her family doctor. He couldn't figure it out, so he sent her to a specialist who suspected beryllium disease. He sent her to Brush's physician, who sent her to the Cleveland Clinic, and there, in 1969, beryllium disease was confirmed. Her first reaction, relief. She was deathly afraid she had emphysema, a disease she knew could tie her to an oxygen tank. Whatever this beryllium disease was, she thought, it couldn't be as bad as that. For the next 10 years, strong medications such as steroids kept Marilyn's disease in check. She kept her job as a rural mail carrier as it didn't require much exertion. Most of the time was spent driving from mailbox to mailbox. But in 1982, she got pneumonia and had to take 3 months off. She tried coming back to work, but she was just too weak, and she never worked again. As long as I didn't do anything, I was fine, like now, sitting here, she says, spreading her arms across the kitchen table, but with the least exertion, I was huffing and puffing. A few years later, she had to start using oxygen. 2 oxygen tanks the size of an old milk can were brought up to the Miller farm. One was placed in the living room, one in the bedroom. The tanks pumped pure oxygen through a long, skinny hose worn on the face. For people like Marilyn, an oxygen hose is a lifeline. Without it, they can't go outside, walk across a room, or summon the strength to wash. But it is also a leash, limiting where they can go and for how long. Marilyn wore the hose for 24 hours a day, though at first she was embarrassed to carry her portable tank in public. Now I don't care, she says. Let them stare if they want to. For several years, the oxygen allowed her to live a fairly normal life, but as her disease progressed, she found she was breathless even with the oxygen. And simple infections became major problems. Just in the last year, she says, she had to be hospitalized 3 times for pneumonia. Every time it takes me longer to recover, she says. Jack takes off his hat and runs his hand through his hair. I think Brush Wellman owes her something, he says. She can't clean, she can't cook, we can't go no place. We should be retired. He wants to sue the company, but Marilyn is against it. That would make me nervous more than anything. What if workers' comp stop paying for this, she says, holding up the oxygen cord. Besides, she says, you're never going to win. They just have too many lawyers. They have too much money behind them. The conversation ends like it began, politely, pleasantly. Call, they say, if you need to know more. 2 weeks later, Marilyn is in Wood County Hospital, room 203. She is sitting up in bed, her face drawn, her hair sticking straight up. I was coughing all weekend, coughing, and I woke up Tuesday with a fever, so I thought I'd better get in here. Unlike 2 weeks ago, she now labors for every breath. When she tries to joke about her hair, her chuckles turn to coughs and she stops. It just seems like there's something in there that I can't get out. Dr. David Atwell comes in and asks her how she's doing. Not too good, she says. He listens to her back and says she might have a fungus in her lungs. They hope to find out what kind so they can treat it. Otherwise, they'll keep her on general antibiotics. She has a fair amount of scarring of lung tissue, so she has trouble fighting off the infections, he says, putting his stethoscope away. But she has a good attitude, and so does her husband. That's important. It's important to have this good support system. The following night, Marilyn is still coughing, but in better spirits. Jack and their son David are there, talking about how a Brush Wellman official, Dennis Habrat, had briefly visited Marilyn. She is impressed that he would drive the 2 hours from Brush headquarters in Cleveland to see her. Her husband scoffs at this, saying he's a big city exec trying to charm the country folks so they don't sue them. You know what he came in here wearing, he asks? A flannel shirt. It was not a flannel shirt, Marilyn says. Oh yes it was. He's really, really smooth. Well, I thought he was nice. You're a bit naive. I guess I am, she smiles. I married you. Respiratory therapist Irma Hillard announces it's time for a breathing treatment. She has Marilyn breathe through a T-shaped inhaler, then she rubs a vibrator on her back to loosen the mucus stuck in her lungs. She has a lot of secretions in her airways, the therapist said. That's what you hear rattling around. When the treatment is over, the therapist listens to her lungs again. Does that lobe sound better than the other one, Marilyn asks hopefully. They all sound pretty full right now, she replies. Watching it all is Dave, the 39-year-old in jeans and work boots, leans against the wall and doesn't say a word. He knows that someday that might be him in the bed. Dave went to work at Brush Wellman in 1980, a dozen years after his mother was diagnosed. He did so over her objections, she says, because the pay was good, $8.26 an hour, and Brush assured him that its new plant in Elmore was safer than the one his mother had worked in Lucky. He worked in a variety of jobs, some having high beryllium exposure levels. In fact, Brush records show Dave worked in areas that repeatedly exceeded the federal safety limit for beryllium dust. Dave says he was more than careful. I was paranoid. I was the butt of a lot of jokes for wearing respirators more than I was supposed to. But 3 years after he started to work there, he came down with flu-like symptoms and was diagnosed with beryllium disease. Mom was more upset than I, he recalls. She knew what was coming. Like his mother, Dave was put on powerful medication. He still looks healthy, even athletic, but his lung capacity is down to 75%. He remains employed at Brush, but under a company program that removes beryllium victims from the plant and puts them into community service jobs. Dave cuts grass and picks up trash near Toledo's Old West End neighborhood, where he has bought and fixed up several old houses. Because beryllium disease affects people differently, there's no way to know how sick Dave will become. A third die of the disease, a third become disabled, and a third remain relatively healthy, says doctors. Dave's physician is optimistic, saying Dave has responded well to steroids. Dave is not so helpful. I'm on the downhill slope. After a few more days in the hospital, Marilyn comes home, but she doesn't feel much better. She spends most of her time lying on the couch. One day after a big spring storm, her eldest son Mick comes over to pick up sticks in the yard, something his mother is particular about. Usually when he comes over, she looks out the kitchen window and waves. This time she doesn't. And when he comes in and tells her there are still some sticks to be collected, he expects her to say, "Well, get at it." But she says nothing. The first week in April, she is back in the hospital, this time Medical College of Ohio in Toledo. "I don't think she would make it through the night," her husband says over the phone. "They called us all up there last night. I'm not exactly sure why. A couple, 3 priests were up there. Doctors can't do much," he says. "She has no lung capacity. There's no way for her to get air in. She can't eat. She's too weak to talk. Maybe a whisper if she's awake." Marilyn Miller was 19 years old when she took a job as a secretary at the local brush beryllium plant. She worked there for only 2 years, but that was long enough for her to contract the disease that would take her life. She died the day after this photograph was taken. There's a photograph here on the site. The next 48 hours seem like weeks. Relatives come and go. Nurses give her more breathing treatments. Dave tries to keep her cool by wetting her face and arms with a washcloth. When nurses shove a tube down Marilyn's nose to suck out phlegm, family members avert their heads or go into the hall. Marilyn coughs, gags, and moans, and greenish mucus is extracted. On Easter Sunday, she can barely whisper, but she manages, "Jack, Jack." Lori, at age 28, her youngest child, phones her father and says he'd better come back in. He does, but she is highly medicated and sleeping when he arrives. A few hours later, at 4:30 a.m. Monday, her vital signs are out of control. A doctor tells Lori she'd better call her family again. She does, but by the time they arrive, Marilyn is dead. When the family returns to the Miller farm, one of the grandsons is cutting the grass. Mick asked him to do it because that's what Marilyn would have wanted. Have the yard look nice for everyone who will be stopping by. Doug, her 44-year-old son, walks into the house via the garage, slapping the side of a spare oxygen tank. "Well, we're not going to need this anymore," he says. They all flop down in chairs. Marilyn had pulled through so many times, they can't believe she didn't again. When Jack comes inside, he pulls out his address book and starts dialing Brush Wellman. He asks for Dennis Habrat and is put through to his voicemail, and leaves the following message. "This is Jack Miller. Marilyn isn't with us anymore. Better tell your lawyer fast." Charlie Barnt, a local funeral director, arrives at the Miller home at 1 p.m. He is a large, friendly man in a gray suit and a white pencil-thin mustache, and Jack has known him for years, ever since their old baseball days. Charlie gathers the family in the living room and, clipboard on his knee, goes over the funeral arrangements. "Do you want Bradner Cemetery? Do you want to order the flowers yourself? Who does her hair?" Dave looks the worst, sprawled in a corner chair, head back, staring at the ceiling. The group then squeezes into 2 cars and drives into Bradner to pick out a casket. They pull up to a white, windowless building on Main Street, and Charlie unlocks the front door. Inside is a wood-paneled room lined with 24 caskets. Charlie takes the family counterclockwise around the room, describing each casket in hushed tones. When he's shown them all, Jack nods politely and Dave leans his hand on a copper casket and stares through it. The family eventually decides on a stainless steel one with a pink interior. When they return home, Sandy, the oldest daughter, looks at all of the cars parked out front. "Looks like we're having a party," she says softly. The viewing is in the Barnt Funeral Home, a converted 2-story house in Wayne. Dozens of people show up, and more than 80 bouquets are brought in. 2 are from Brush Wellman. Old neighbors and friends pat Jack on the back and say they are sorry. "She just couldn't breathe anymore," he tells one friend. Even more people attend the evening showing. In one corner, 3 men sit quietly. At their sides are their portable oxygen tanks. All 3 men, Butch, Bob, and Gary, worked at Brush Wellman in Elmore, and all 3 have beryllium disease. Butch says this is his 3rd funeral of someone who has died from the disease. "This is my 4th, says Bob. "This is my 4th too, Gary says. Then they list them and realize they forgot one, so this is their 5th. The funeral is the following morning at St. James Lutheran in Bradner, and is so packed the funeral director has to set up extra chairs in the back. The Millers sit up front, red-faced in tears. In the back, in a dark suit, is Mr. Habrat from Brush-Wellman. Pastor addresses the group. When we lose someone we love, we want to know why. We want to blame someone. There are no human words or gestures that can take away the grief you are feeling now. There are, however, promises of eternal comfort, which are fulfilled for Marilyn on Monday morning, when she passed over into the next life and found herself with God. At Bradner Cemetery, after all the mourners have departed, Lester Sterling, a third-generation gravedigger, buries Marilyn. Yeah, I knew the family, he says. I knew Mick, and my dad went to school with Jack. That's the thing about this job. Half the people you bury you know, and the other half are your cousins. He fills in the grave with a shovel, and when he is done, he carefully replaces the squares of grass, then places several bouquets of flowers on top. The sun is out now, and the gravedigger wipes his brow. Well, at least she made it through Easter. Brush-Wellman's Mr. Habrat says the company did everything it could to help Marilyn. It helped arrange the best medical care and gave the family more than $25,000 in the last 5 years. He would come out to the farm and hand-deliver the checks. Once, Jack was in the field, so he left the check inside the door. The money wasn't to fend off a lawsuit, he says. We wanted to ensure that whatever Marilyn needed, it would be available for her. And Brush does this for other victims, he says. He often visits their homes, asks how the company can help, and passes along some money. He knows families are skeptical and angry. These are difficult situations, he says. I wish they were different. I wish I could go do something to cure the person or make the disease go away. 2 weeks after the funeral, Jack is sitting on a bench outside the barn, petting his brown shepherd, Tammy. Mick is nearby, sitting on a plastic bucket flipped upside down. It is a gray, drizzly morning, and the two have just finished milking cows. A few minutes later, Dave pulls up in his pickup. The three talk about the good times, Marilyn's final days, and whether they could have done more to help. Mick tells a story about how a few years after Marilyn was diagnosed, she was driving down the road and saw an old woman planting flowers. It was a big, beautiful display, and this woman was 80 years old. And Ma said to me, I'm just never going to be an old lady planting flowers. They talk about whether they should sue Brush-Wellman, how Jack will handle living alone, and what can be done to help Dave. Jack says he doesn't know how much about beryllium disease, or who's responsible, but it needs to stop. How many Marilyns do you want out there? With that, Dave climbs back into his truck, Mick goes back into the barn, and Jack heads into the house. For now, they say, there are chores to do.